February 14th, 1945. Manila was burning. The capital of the Philippines had become a furnace of steel and flesh, caught between the retreating Japanese forces and the advancing American liberation. Buildings collapsed into their own shadows. Streets ran with water from burst pipes, mixing with blood and ash. The smell was unbearable, a chemical sweetness of charred wood, burnt rubber, and death ripening in the tropical heat. In a forgotten corner of the Ermita district, behind what had once been a missionary hospital, stood a concrete structure no larger than a schoolhouse. Its windows were boarded shut. The door bore Japanese characters warning against entry. Inside that building, in a room measuring perhaps 20 feet by 30, 15 Korean women lay on the floor in various stages of consciousness. They had not eaten in 15 days. Their names were recorded later by American medics: Kim Sun-ja, age 23, Park Young-hee, age 26. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lee Myung-suk, barely 19. They wore the remnants of white nursing uniforms, now grey with filth and stained with the evidence of their abandonment. Some still clutched empty canteens. Others had given up even that small gesture of hope. The youngest among them, a girl named Choi Min-ah, whispered prayers in Korean, her voice so faint it barely disturbed the flies that had begun to gather. Outside, the Battle of Manila raged with particular savagery. The Japanese command had decided that if they could not hold the city, they would destroy it. Demolition squads moved methodically through neighborhoods, planting explosives, setting fires, executing civilians suspected of aiding the Americans. The streets became killing grounds where no distinction was made between combatants and the innocent. American forces pushed forward block by bloody block, house by house, fighting an enemy that had transformed the Pearl of the Orient into a death trap. Yet, in that sealed room, the war seemed distant, almost irrelevant. The women's world had shrunk to the dimensions of their prison. Time was measured not in hours, but in heartbeats growing fainter, in the progression of thirst that turned tongues to leather and lips to cracked parchment. They had been nurses, recruited in Korea under promises of dignified work supporting the Japanese war effort. The recruiters had spoken of hospitals, of caring for wounded soldiers, of serving the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Some had volunteered, believing the propaganda. Others had been coerced, their families threatened, their futures stolen by bureaucratic stamps on official papers. They arrived in Manila in 1943, when the city still glittered with a facade of normalcy. The Japanese occupation had established clinics and field hospitals where Korean and Taiwanese nurses worked alongside Japanese medical staff. For a brief period, the promise seemed real. They treated patients, learned new procedures, wrote letters home describing their service. But as the war turned against Japan, as American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, the veneer cracked, resources dwindled, supplies stopped arriving. The hospitals became holding pens for the dying rather than places of healing. The nurses found themselves trapped in a city preparing for apocalypse, their utility exhausted, their existence an inconvenient reminder of imperial overreach. When MacArthur's forces landed at Lingayen Gulf in early January of 1945, the Japanese command in Manila faced a crisis. What to do with the thousands of civilians, the collaborators, the comfort women, the auxiliary staff who had served the occupation? Some were evacuated, most were simply abandoned. The Korean nurses fell into the latter category, forgotten assets in a collapsing empire. On January 29th, a Japanese officer visited their quarters. He carried no supplies, only orders. The facility was closing. They were to remain inside until further notice. He locked the door from the outside, removed the key, and walked away without explanation. The sound of that lock turning echoed like a verdict. For the first 3 days, they believed someone would return. They rationed the water left in their canteens, a few sips each per day. They sang songs to keep spirits up, hymns learned in mission schools, Korean folk melodies that reminded them of homes they might never see again. Park Young-hee, who had studied in Seoul before the war, led them in reciting poetry, anything to distract from the growing hunger. By the 5th day, The water was gone. They began drinking from a bucket that had collected rainwater through a crack in the ceiling, murky liquid that tasted of rust and rot. Some became ill immediately, vomiting what little remained in their stomachs. Others refused to drink, preferring thirst to sickness, though eventually desperation won. The bombing intensified. They could hear the shriek of shells, the percussion of explosions that shook dust from the ceiling. Once, a blast nearby knocked them all to the floor, and for a moment they believed the building would collapse on them. Perhaps that would have been mercy, but the structure held, and they remained entombed within it. By the 10th day, conversation ceased. Words required energy they no longer possessed. They lay in small groups, conserving warmth, drifting in and out of feverish sleep. Hallucinations began. Kim Sun-ja saw her mother preparing rice in the kitchen of their Busan home, the steam rising like prayer. Lee Myung-suk heard children singing outside, though the streets were empty of anything but death. Choi Min-ah, the youngest, spoke to her dead brother, killed in China 3 years earlier. She apologized to him, though for what sin she could no longer remember. Time became fluid, unmeasurable. Days blurred into a continuous twilight. Their bodies began the process of shutting down, conserving what little energy remained for the essential functions of breath and heartbeat. Skin grew taut over bones, eyes sank into hollows, hair began to fall out in clumps. On the 13th day, one of them died. Her name was Jung Hae-won, age 31, the oldest among them. She had been a practicing nurse in Pyongyang before the war. Respected, skilled, hopeful, she passed quietly in the night, and when dawn came, the others realized she was no longer breathing. They had no strength to move her body, so she remained where she lay, a terrible reminder of what awaited them all. The smell of death joined the smell of sickness in the enclosed space. Some prayed for rescue, others prayed for release. A few simply stared at the ceiling, their minds retreating to places memory could still reach, homes and families and moments when life had held promise. Outside, the American 1st Cavalry Division was fighting its way through the northern districts of Manila. Soldiers moved through rubble-strewn streets, clearing buildings, searching for survivors amid the destruction. They had seen the worst of urban warfare. Japanese soldiers fighting from tunnels and bunkers, civilians caught in the crossfire, evidence of massacres committed in the final days of occupation. Corpsman Second Class David Martinez moved with a rifle platoon through what remained of the Ermita district. He was 24 years old, born in El Paso, Texas, the son of Mexican immigrants who had crossed the border seeking work during the Depression. He had joined the Navy in 1942, trained as a medic, and served on hospital ships before volunteering for ground duty. His hands had stitched wounds, administered morphine, closed the eyes of men beyond saving. He carried his medical kit like a sacred trust, the Red Cross painted on his helmet both protection and declaration. Martinez believed in the simple mathematics of medicine, that lives could be saved through knowledge, skill, and the refusal to surrender to death. He had seen enough men die to know that survival often hinged on moments, on someone choosing to look in the right place at the right time. The building they approached seemed unremarkable, just another concrete shell among thousands. The lieutenant signaled to bypass it, to keep moving toward more promising targets. But Martinez noticed something. The Japanese characters on the door, still visible beneath soot and ash. He couldn't read them, but their presence suggested official use, perhaps a storage facility or command post. He called out to the platoon's translator, a Nisei soldier named Sergeant Henry Tanaka. Tanaka stepped forward, studied the characters, and frowned. Medical facility. Off limits. The words were bureaucratic, the kind of warning that usually meant supplies or records, things the Japanese had tried to preserve or destroy. The lieutenant nodded to Martinez. "Check it out, Doc. Be careful." Martinez approached the door with his weapon drawn. He tried the handle. Locked. He stepped back and kicked hard, once, twice. The wood around the lock splintered but held. A private with a crowbar moved forward, wedged it into the gap, and pulled. With a sharp crack, the door gave way. The smell hit them first, a wave of putrefaction and human waste that made several soldiers gag and turn away. Martinez covered his nose with his sleeve and stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The room was thick with flies, their buzzing the only sound. He saw shapes on the floor, bodies, or what he assumed were bodies, motionless in the gloom. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered behind him. Martinez moved forward carefully, his medical instincts overriding his revulsion. As his vision cleared, he realized the shapes were women, dressed in ragged white uniforms, lying in clusters as though seeking warmth from one another. He knelt beside the nearest figure, pressed his fingers to her throat. No pulse. He moved to the next. Nothing. The third. Nothing. His heart sank. They were too late. Another goddamn tomb in a city full of them. But then, as he reached the fourth woman, he felt it. A flutter beneath his fingertips, faint as a whisper, but unmistakable. He shouted over his shoulder, "I got a live one! Get water! Get blankets! Move!" The platoon sprang into action. Canteens appeared. Corpsmen rushed in with medical supplies. They began checking each body systematically, and to everyone's shock, found more signs of life. 14 women still breathing, though barely, their bodies on the very edge of death. Martinez cradled the head of the woman whose pulse he had found. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, clouded with fever. She stared at him without comprehension, as though he were an apparition from a dream. He unscrewed his canteen, tilted it gently to her lips. "Easy now. Just a little. You're safe." The water touched her cracked lips, and she flinched as though burned. He tried again, more gently, letting drops fall into her mouth. She swallowed reflexively, then coughed, a weak spasm that shook her entire frame. He supported her head, murmuring reassurance in English she could not understand, but the tone carried what words could not. Around the room, other medics repeated the same careful ritual. Water measured in sips, blankets wrapped around emaciated frames, hands checking vital signs, assessing damage, calculating chances of survival. The soldiers worked with grim efficiency, their faces set in concentration, aware they were racing against death and might still lose. Sergeant Tanaka knelt beside Martinez, looking at the women with an expression of profound sadness. "They're Korean," he said quietly. "The uniforms, military nurses. Someone locked them in here and left them to die." Martinez felt rage surge through him, hot and clean. "How long?" Tanaka shook his head. "Days. Maybe longer, judging by their condition." He paused, then added, "There's a body in the corner. We were too late for her." Martinez looked toward where. Tanaka indicated, saw the still form of Young Hae-won, and closed his eyes briefly. 15 days, he thought. These women had survived 15 days without food or water, abandoned by the very army they had served. The cruelty was beyond comprehension, yet here was the evidence, breathing shallowly in his arms. Outside, the war continued its relentless arithmetic of destruction. Inside this forgotten room, a different calculation was being made. 14 lives hanging by threads so fine they might snap at any moment, and a handful of American soldiers determined to pull them back from the edge, one careful sip of water at a time. The woman in Martinez's arms whispered something in Korean, her voice barely audible. He leaned closer, trying to understand. She repeated it, and though he didn't know the words, he recognized the tone. It was a question, tentative and terrified. Tanaka translated softly, "She's asking if you're going to kill her." Martinez felt something crack inside his chest. He looked into her eyes, those dark pools of fear and resignation, and shook his head firmly. "No. No. You're safe now. You're safe with me." He didn't know if she understood the English words, but he repeated them anyway, like a promise he was determined to keep. The evacuation began immediately, though moving the women proved nearly impossible. Their bodies had become so fragile that lifting them risked breaking bones weakened by malnutrition. Martinez organized the operation with the precision of a battlefield surgeon, assigning each woman to a 2-man carry team, instructing them to move slowly, to support the head and spine, to watch for signs of shock. The youngest among them, Choi Min-ah, weighed barely 80 pounds. When Private Miller lifted her onto the stretcher, he felt as though he were carrying a child, her frame so diminished that her bones pressed against skin like the framework of a paper lantern. Her breathing was shallow, each inhalation a visible effort. Miller, who had 3 younger sisters back in Iowa, found himself blinking back tears as he adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. The sound of artillery continued in the distance, a reminder that Manila's liberation was far from complete. Japanese forces still held pockets of the city, fighting with suicidal determination. Snipers remained active in damaged buildings, making every street crossing a calculated risk. The evacuation route had to be planned carefully, avoiding exposed intersections where a single well-placed shot could kill patient and medic alike. Martinez consulted with the platoon lieutenant, spreading a map across the hood of a jeep. They traced a path through back alleys and covered passages, using shell-damaged structures as shields. The distance to the nearest collection point was only 6 blocks, but in urban combat, 6 blocks might as well be 6 miles. Every meter would have to be fought for or negotiated with extreme caution. As the first stretcher-bearers prepared to move out, Martinez noticed one of the women trying to sit up. It was Park Young-hee, her face grey with exhaustion, but her eyes alert. She was speaking rapidly in Korean, gesturing toward the building they were leaving. Tanaka hurried over to translate. "She's asking about someone named Jung-hae-won. She wants to know if we're bringing her body." Martinez felt his chest tighten. He had seen the corpse in the corner, had known immediately that she was beyond help. In the chaos of triage, he had focused on the living, pushing aside the reality of the dead. But now, confronted with Park Young-hee's desperate question, he realized what it meant to leave someone behind. "We can't," the lieutenant said quietly. "We don't have the manpower. We need everyone focused on getting the survivors out safely." Martinez looked at Park Young-hee, saw the anguish in her expression, and made a decision. "Give me 2 men and 5 minutes. The lieutenant hesitated, then nodded. Martinez returned to the building with 2 soldiers. They found a piece of canvas and wrapped Jung-hae-won's body carefully, treating her remains with the same dignity they would afford a fallen comrade. She had been a nurse, Martinez reasoned. She had served the wounded, even if under duress. That deserved respect. They carried her out and placed her gently in one of the trucks. When Park Young-hee saw them bringing the body, she began to cry, not from grief alone, but from gratitude that even in death, her friend would not be abandoned. The gesture spoke volumes about the Americans' intentions, demonstrating that their compassion extended beyond the merely expedient. They cared not just for the living who might offer intelligence or propaganda value, but for the dead who offered nothing but the weight of their absence. The convoy moved slowly through the ruined streets, medics walking alongside the stretchers, weapons at the ready. Twice they heard rifle fire and took cover, waiting for scouts to clear the path. Once, a building collapsed just ahead of them, sending a cloud of dust and debris rolling across the road. They detoured through a burned-out marketplace, where vendors' stalls stood like skeletal remains. The women on the stretchers watched the devastation pass by with wide, disbelieving eyes. Many had been locked in that room for the entire battle, hearing the destruction but unable to see it. Now, confronted with Manila's corpse-strewn streets and gutted buildings, they began to understand the scale of what had transpired. The city they had known, with its Spanish architecture and tropical gardens, had been transformed into an apocalyptic wasteland. Lee Myung-suk, barely conscious, whispered something that made her stretcher-bearers pause. Tanaka jogged over to translate. "She's asking if this is hell, if they died in the room, and this is the afterlife." The soldier carrying her front end, a farm boy from Nebraska, shook his head firmly even before the translation finished. "No, ma'am, this is just war. But you're alive, and we're going to keep you that way." His certainty seemed to anchor her, and she closed her eyes, either accepting his words or too exhausted to argue. They reached the collection point as dusk began to settle over the city. It was a partially intact church, its bell tower damaged but walls still standing, now serving as a casualty clearing station. Medical personnel swarmed the new arrivals, assessing conditions, prioritizing treatment, shouting orders over the general chaos. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. A doctor approached Martinez, clipboard in hand, and began the familiar litany of questions. How long without food? Water? Any visible injuries? Martinez answered mechanically, his mind already moving to the next crisis. But as he turned to leave, he felt a hand grip his sleeve. Kim Sun-ja had raised herself up slightly, her strength nearly spent by the gesture. She pressed something into his palm, a small object he couldn't identify in the fading light. Later, when he had a moment to examine it, he found it was a button, carved from what looked like bone or shell, with a simple flower pattern etched on its surface. It must have come from her uniform, a small piece of identity she had clung to through 15 days of hell. By giving it to him, she was offering the only thing of value she possessed, a token of gratitude that transcended language and culture. Martinez kept that button in his medical kit for the rest of the war, and afterward mounted it in a small frame that sat on his desk for the remainder of his life. Whenever colleagues asked about it, he would tell them it was a reminder. Of what? They would ask. That every patient matters, he would reply. That every life is worth the effort. The stretchers were improvised from blankets and rifle poles, crude but effective. As they carried the first woman out into the sunlight, she screamed, a thin sound like tearing paper. The brightness after 2 weeks of darkness was agony to her eyes. Martinez quickly draped a cloth over her face, filtering the light, murmuring apologies she couldn't understand. One by one, the survivors emerged from their tomb, soldiers who had seen the aftermath of Banzai charges, who had walked through villages where entire families had been massacred, found themselves shaken by the sight of these women. They were ghosts in white uniforms, their skin translucent, their bodies so light that carrying them felt like holding shadows. A jeep arrived with additional medical supplies. Martinez established a triage point in the shell of an adjacent building, out of direct sunlight, protected from sniper fire by collapsed walls. He worked methodically, checking each woman for dehydration, infection, organ failure. His findings were grim. All 14 showed signs of severe starvation. Their pulses were weak and irregular, blood pressure dangerously low. Several had developed bed sores from lying motionless for days. 2 were running fevers that suggested sepsis. 1 woman's abdomen was distended, possibly from liver failure. The miracle was not that 1 had died, but that 14 had somehow survived. The intravenous fluids had to be administered carefully. Too much too fast, and their systems would go into shock. Martinez started with small amounts. Saline solution dripped slowly into veins that had collapsed from dehydration. He showed the other corpsmen how to find the veins by touch, how to stabilize the needle, how to monitor for adverse reactions. Kim Sun-ja, the first woman he had found alive, lay on a stretcher watching him work. Her eyes followed his movements with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. When he checked her IV line, she flinched, then seemed surprised when his touch remained gentle. He smiled at her, a small gesture meant to convey safety, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Sergeant Tanaka moved between the women, speaking to them in Korean. His parents had emigrated from Japan before he was born, but he had learned Korean during intelligence training, recognizing that Asian languages would be valuable in the Pacific Theater. Now his linguistic skills became a bridge between trauma and trust. He knelt beside Park Young-hee, who was conscious but unresponsive to the medic's attempts at communication. In Korean, he asked her name, where she was from, how long they had been locked inside. At first, she simply stared at him, as though his words were reaching her from a great distance. Then, slowly, tears began to stream down her face. "Busan," she whispered. "I am from Busan. We have been here 15 days. Maybe 16. I cannot remember." Her voice broke. "We thought no one would come. We thought we would die like Haewon." Tanaka placed his hand over hers, a gesture that made her flinch before she realized he meant no harm. "You're not going to die," he said firmly. "These men are doctors, American doctors. They're going to help you." The word American seemed to strike her like a physical blow. Her eyes widened, and she looked around frantically at the soldiers moving through the makeshift hospital. She began to speak rapidly, her words tumbling over each other in panic. Tanaka listened, his expression growing darker, then turned to Martinez. "She thinks we're going to execute them. She's asking us to make it quick, to not torture them first." Martinez stopped what he was doing, his hands frozen over an IV bag. He looked at the woman, at her terrified eyes, and felt a wave of fury at the Japanese who had taught her to expect such treatment. "Tell her," he said slowly, "that we are not executioners. Tell her we are medics. Our job is to save lives, not take them. Tell her she is under American protection now, and no one will hurt her." Tanaka translated, his voice steady and reassuring. Park Young-hee listened, her breathing shallow, and when he finished, she asked a single question. "Why? Why would you help us? We are enemy." Martinez heard the translation and replied, without hesitation. "Because you're human beings. Because you're hurt. Because it's the right thing to do." When Tanaka conveyed his words, something in Park Young-hee's expression cracked. She turned her face away and wept silently, her shoulders shaking with sobs that had been held back for too long. The afternoon wore on, the sun climbing toward its zenith and turning the ruined city into a furnace. Martinez and his team worked without pause, rotating between patients, adjusting IV drips, cleaning wounds, administering what limited medications they had. Sulfur powder for infections, morphine for those in pain, vitamins for those whose bodies had begun to consume themselves. Lee Myung-suk, the 19-year-old who had been praying when they found her, regained consciousness around 1400 hours. She opened her eyes, saw the American corpsman adjusting her IV, and began to cry. Not from fear, but from confusion. The medic, a baby-faced private from Iowa named Danny Miller, didn't know what to say. He simply held her hand and waited until the crying subsided. When Tanaka came to translate, Lee Myung-suk asked, "Are you angels? Have we died?" The question was so earnest, so childlike, that several soldiers within earshot felt their throats tighten. Tanaka shook his head gently. "No, you're alive. You're in Manila. The Americans have liberated the city. You're safe now." She looked around at the ruined building, at the soldiers in their dusty uniforms, at the IV line running into her arm. "Safe," she repeated, as though testing the word in her mouth. It tasted foreign, impossible. As the women stabilized, Martinez began to piece together their story. Through Tanaka's translations, he learned they had been recruited in Korea between 1942 and 1943. Some had been nursing students. Others had completed their training. The Japanese military needed medical personnel for the expanding war, and Korean women were considered expendable labor. They had worked in Manila's military hospitals, treating wounded soldiers, assisting in surgeries, managing the overflow of casualties as American air raids intensified. The conditions had been difficult but bearable. They had been housed in dormitories, given rations, allowed to write letters home, though the letters were heavily censored and rarely reached their destinations. But as 1945 began and MacArthur's forces closed in, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The Japanese command became desperate, paranoid. Resources were diverted to combat units. The hospitals were stripped of supplies. The nurses found themselves working 16-hour shifts with no equipment, watching men die from treatable wounds because there was no medicine, no bandages, nothing. Then came the order to evacuate. But evacuation was reserved for Japanese personnel, not for Korean auxiliaries. The nurses were told to remain in their quarters until transport could be arranged. Days passed. No transport came. Instead, a lieutenant arrived with a padlock and instructions that they were to wait quietly. The Imperial Army would return for them when the situation stabilized. That was January 29th. The situation never stabilized. The lieutenant never returned. The nurses were simply forgotten, one more inconvenient detail in the chaotic collapse of occupation. They had banged on the door for hours that first day, shouting for help. No one answered. They had tried to break through the boarded windows, but the wood was reinforced, and they had no tools. By the second day, they realized they were on their own. Kim Sun-ja, who had served as their unofficial leader, organized them into shifts. They prayed together, sang together, told stories of home to keep morale up. When the water ran out, they tried to ration the contaminated rainwater, knowing it would make them sick but seeing no alternative. The bombing grew worse. They huddled together during the worst attacks, certain that each explosion might be the one that buried them alive. When the building shook, they held hands and waited for death. When silence returned, they whispered gratitude to ancestors and gods, though faith grew harder with each passing day. By the 10th day, despair had settled in like a physical presence. They stopped talking about rescue and began talking about last wishes, messages for families they would never see again. Park Young-hee, the eldest, at 26, told them about her younger brother in Seoul, how he had wanted to become a doctor. Lee Myung-suk described her mother's garden in Daegu, the way persimmons hung from branches in autumn. Choi Min-ah, the youngest, had cried for her father, a fisherman who used to sing while mending nets. They had been making peace with death when Jung Hae-won passed on the 13th night. Her death was expected, inevitable, but it still shattered what remained of their hope. If Hae-won could die, so could they all. And they would, slowly, in darkness, forgotten. Martinez listened to these accounts with growing anger, not at the women, but at the system that had used them and discarded them like broken equipment. He thought of his own sister back in El Paso, working in a garment factory, supporting the war effort by sewing parachutes. The idea of her locked in a room to starve made his blood boil. "You did nothing wrong," he told them through Tanaka. "Nothing. What happened to you was a crime." By nightfall, all 14 women had stabilized enough for transport to a field hospital. Martinez arranged for ambulances, such as they were, converted trucks with medical markings. He personally supervised the loading, ensuring each woman was secured properly, blankets tucked around them, IV bags hung securely. Before the convoy departed, Kim Sun-ja reached out and caught Martinez's sleeve. He turned, and she spoke in halting, broken English, words she must have learned years ago in a mission school. "Thank you. You save us." Her pronunciation was awkward, but the gratitude was unmistakable. Martinez felt his eyes burn. He covered her hand with his. "You're going to be okay," he said. "All of you. You're going to survive this." She searched his face, looking for deception or false comfort, and found neither. Slowly, carefully, she nodded. The trucks rolled out as the sun set, casting Manila in shades of gold and blood. Martinez watched them disappear into the ruined cityscape, then turned back to his platoon. They had more buildings to clear, more survivors to find, more bodies to bury. But for a moment, he allowed himself to feel something other than exhaustion. Pride, maybe, or purpose. They had saved 14 lives today. In a war that dealt in death by the millions, 14 seemed like a drop in the ocean. Yet those 14 women would remember. They would tell their stories. And maybe, just maybe, that mattered. The field hospital was chaos incarnate, a former school building requisitioned by the army and transformed into a cathedral of suffering. Cots lined the hallways. Wounded soldiers lay on stretchers in the courtyard, waiting their turn for surgery. Nurses in blood-stained uniforms moved with exhausted efficiency, their faces masks of professional detachment hiding private horror. Into this maelstrom arrived 14 Korean women so emaciated they looked like illustrations from medical textbooks on starvation. The head nurse, Captain Eleanor Walsh from Boston, took one look at them and immediately cleared a classroom for isolation. These women were too vulnerable to infections to be placed in the general population. They needed quiet, stability, and intensive care. Dr. James Whitmore, a surgeon from Philadelphia who had been operating for 18 hours straight, examined them one by one. His assessment was clinical but laced with outrage. Acute malnutrition, severe dehydration, multiple organ stress, probable kidney damage, 2 with pneumonia, 1 with suspected tuberculosis. His report to the commanding officer included a paragraph that would later be cited in war crimes documentation. These women were deliberately left to die. This was not combat casualty. This was abandonment with intent to kill. The treatment began in earnest. The women were fed carefully, small amounts of broth at first, then gradually increased as their stomachs adjusted. Too much food too quickly would kill them as surely as starvation had nearly done. The doctors monitored every meal, every bowel movement, every vital sign. Captain Walsh assigned her best nurses to their care, women who had seen enough suffering to approach trauma with both competence and compassion. One nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, was Chinese-American, and though she didn't speak Korean, her presence seemed to comfort the patients. Perhaps seeing an Asian face in an American uniform suggested possibilities they had not imagined. The psychological recovery proved harder than the physical. The women flinched at sudden movements. They woke screaming from nightmares. When male doctors approached, even to examine them, several panicked, their bodies remembering violence even as their minds tried to trust. Captain Walsh implemented a policy that only female staff would provide direct care unless absolutely necessary. Park Young-hee, whose English was the strongest among them, became their unofficial spokesperson. On the third day in the hospital, she asked to speak with the commanding officer. Colonel Robert Harrison was a career military man, gruff and efficient, but her request intrigued him. He arrived expecting complaints or demands, and instead found a thin woman sitting upright in bed, her hands folded, her expression determined. Through Sergeant Tanaka, she asked a single question. "What will happen to us?" Harrison considered his answer carefully. "You will receive medical treatment until you are well enough to be discharged. Then you will be processed as displaced persons. We will attempt to repatriate you to Korea, if that is your wish, or help you resettle elsewhere if you prefer." Park Young-hee absorbed this information, then asked, "We are not prisoners?" Harrison shook his head firmly. "No. You are victims. There is a difference." She looked at him for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether he was lying. Finally, she bowed her head in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Colonel. We did not expect mercy." Harrison felt a surge of something uncomfortable, shame perhaps, or sorrow. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "mercy is not something you should have to be surprised by. It should be the baseline of human behavior." When Tanaka translated, Park Young-hee smiled sadly. "That is a beautiful idea, Colonel, but it is not the world we have lived in." Over the following weeks, the women grew stronger. Colour returned to their cheeks. The hollow darkness left their eyes. They began to laugh sometimes, small sounds that startled even themselves. The nurses brought them books, paper for writing letters, even a radio that played American music. Glenn Miller, Bing Crosby, songs in a language they barely understood but that somehow spoke to renewal. Lee Myung-suk, the youngest survivor, took to drawing. Someone gave her a pencil and scrap paper, and she filled pages with sketches of home. Her mother's face, the mountains near Daegu, cherry blossoms in spring. The nurses pinned her drawings on the wall, and soon other patients stopped by to admire them. Art, it seemed, needed no translation. Choi Min-ah, who had been so close to death when they found her, recovered with remarkable speed. Within 2 weeks, she was helping the nurses, carrying water, changing bandages, translating when Park Young-hee was unavailable. Her youth and resilience became a source of hope for the others. If she could survive, perhaps they all could. But not all healing was straightforward. Kim Sun-ja, the woman Martinez had found first, suffered recurring nightmares. She would wake, gasping, convinced she was back in the locked room, feeling the walls close in. The nurses learned to respond quickly, turning on lights, speaking calmly, anchoring her in the present. "You're safe. You're in the hospital. The war is over here." One night, Martinez was called to the women's ward because Kim Sun-ja was having a particularly severe episode. He found her curled on her cot, trembling, muttering in Korean. When he knelt beside her, she looked at him with wild eyes, not recognizing him at first. Then, slowly, memory returned. She reached out and touched his face, as though confirming he was real. "You came back," she whispered in Korean. Tanaka, who had arrived with Martinez, translated. Martinez nodded, understanding even before the translation. "I told you you were safe. I meant it." Kim Sun-ja began to cry, not from fear this time, but from relief. She had been holding on to his promise for weeks, terrified it was a lie, a trick her dying mind had invented. But here he was, solid and real, proof that kindness existed. The incident crystallized something for Martinez. These women had survived physical starvation, but they were also starving for trust, for proof that the world contained something other than cruelty. Every gentle touch, every kept promise, every moment of respect was nourishment as vital as food. He made it a point to visit the ward regularly, not just as a medic, but as a reminder. He brought small gifts when he could, candy bars, magazines, a harmonica he taught Lee Myung-suk to play badly, to everyone's amusement. His presence became a ritual, a bridge between their trauma and their tentative hope for the future. As Manila slowly transformed from battlefield to occupied city, the women's story began to spread. Journalists heard about the 15 Korean nurses, about the locked room and the 15-day ordeal. Some wanted to interview them, to photograph them, to turn their suffering into headlines. Colonel Harrison refused all requests. "These women have been through enough," he told reporters. "They don't need to be spectacles." But one journalist, a correspondent named Margaret Burke-White, approached differently. She asked permission to simply sit with the women, to listen without taking notes, to understand before writing. Walsh granted her access, and Burke-White spent 3 days in the ward, talking through translators, sharing meals, building trust. When she finally wrote her piece, it was not sensationalist or exploitative. Instead, it focused on the quiet moments of recovery, the small victories of survivors learning to live again. Her article, published months later, included one line that would be quoted for decades. "In a war defined by mass death, I witnessed 15 women who chose, against all odds, to keep breathing. That choice was the truest act of resistance." By April, the women were declared medically stable. The question of what came next loomed large. Korea was still under Japanese occupation, though rumors suggested the war in the Pacific was turning decisively. Returning home while the conflict continued was impossible. Some expressed interest in remaining in the Philippines, where the American occupation offered relative safety. Others wanted to wait until Korea was liberated, however long that might take. The army established a displaced persons program, offering education and job training to civilians caught in the war's aftermath. Several of the nurses enrolled, studying English, learning about American culture, preparing for an uncertain future. Park Young-hee, whose leadership had kept them alive during those 15 days, applied to work as a translator for the military government. Her application was accepted within a week. Lee Myung-suk pursued her art, encouraged by a Red Cross volunteer who recognized her talent. She began creating larger works, paintings that depicted not just her memories of Korea, but her experience of survival. One painting, titled 15 Days, showed a dark room, with a single shaft of light breaking through a crack. It won a prize in a local exhibition and was eventually donated to a museum. Choi Min-ah, whose youth and resilience had inspired the others, decided to continue her nursing education. She enrolled in a program run by the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, training alongside Filipino and American women. Her instructors remarked on her extraordinary empathy with patients, a quality born from her own suffering. She understood, in ways that could not be taught, what it meant to fight for survival. Kim Sun-ja, the woman whose pulse Martinez had found first, took longer to decide her path. The nightmares continued, though with decreasing frequency. She spent hours walking the recovering streets of Manila, watching the city rebuild itself from rubble. One afternoon, she visited the building where they had been imprisoned. It had been partially demolished during the fighting. One wall collapsed, exposing the room where they had nearly died. She stood there for a long time, staring at the space that had contained so much suffering. Then she picked up a piece of rubble, pocketed it, and walked away. Later, She told Captain Walsh she wanted to become a counselor, helping other survivors process their trauma. "I know what it is to be left behind," she said through a translator. "I want to make sure no one else feels that alone." The war in the Pacific ended in August of 1945 with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The news reached Manila via radio, crackling and distant, but unmistakable. The 14 women gathered around the receiver in the hospital common room, listening to the Japanese emperor's voice announcing surrender. It was the first time many of them had heard Hirohito speak. When the broadcast ended, silence filled the room. No one cheered, no one celebrated. The relief was too complicated, too tangled with loss. They had survived, yes, but at what cost? How many had died while they were locked in that room? How many Korean women, forced into service like them, had not been found in time? Park Young-hee spoke first, her voice steady. "We have been given something rare, a second chance at life. We must use it well, to honor those who were not so fortunate." The others nodded, a solemn pact forming in that moment. They would live fully, loudly, determinedly. They would tell their stories. They would not let the world forget. In September, the first ships carrying repatriated civilians to Korea began departing from Manila Harbor. 6 of the 14 nurses chose to return home, including Park Young-hee, who wanted to search for her family. The partings were tearful, promises to write exchanged, though everyone knew such promises were fragile in the chaos of post-war Asia. Martinez came to see them off. He had been reassigned to a hospital ship, preparing to return to the United States, but he made time for goodbyes. Park Young-hee bowed deeply to him, the formal Korean gesture of profound respect. When she straightened, her eyes were wet. "You gave us life," she said in careful English, "not just by finding us, but by treating us like humans when we had forgotten we were." Martinez, uncomfortable with praise, shook his head. "You survived because you're strong. I just opened a door." She smiled at his modesty. "Perhaps, but even the strongest need someone to open the door." He could not argue with that. Kim Sun-ja was the last to board the ship. She hesitated at the gangplank, looking back at Martinez one final time. In Korean, she said something that Tanaka translated. She says she will never forget your face, that when she was certain she would die, your face was the first sign that the world still had mercy. Martinez felt his throat tighten. He saluted her, a gesture of respect between equals. She returned it clumsily, then smiled through her tears and walked up the gangplank. The 8 women who remained in the Philippines built new lives. Lee Myung-suk's art career flourished. Choi Min-ah graduated from nursing school and worked in a Manila hospital for 3 decades, eventually training a generation of Filipino nurses. Kim Sun-ja became a pioneering trauma counselor, her own experience giving her unique insight into recovery. They stayed in contact with each other, meeting annually on February 14th, the anniversary of their liberation. The gatherings were small, quiet affairs, marked by prayer and remembrance. They would light 15 candles, one for each woman who had been in that room, including Jung Hae-won, who had not survived to see freedom. Martinez returned to Texas after the war, married his childhood sweetheart, and worked as a civilian nurse at a veterans hospital in El Paso. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, the memories too heavy for casual conversation. But every February, he would receive letters from the Philippines, written in improving English, updating him on lives that continued because of one cold morning in Manila. In 1978, Kim Sun-ja published a memoir in Korean titled 15 Days, 15 Years. It detailed not just the ordeal in the locked room, but the long process of healing afterward. The book was controversial in Korea, where discussion of Korean collaboration with the Japanese remained taboo. Some criticized her for speaking publicly. Others praised her courage. The book was never translated into English during her lifetime, but excerpts appeared in academic journals. Historians used her account to document the treatment of Korean auxiliary workers during the war, a chapter of history that had been largely overlooked. Her testimony joined others in building a record of suffering that could not be denied or forgotten. In 1993, 5 of the surviving nurses, now elderly women, returned to Manila for the first time since the war. The city had transformed beyond recognition, gleaming skyscrapers where rubble had once sprawled. They visited the site of the old missionary hospital. A shopping mall now stood where their prison had been. No plaque marked the location. No memorial acknowledged what had happened there. Lee Myung-suk, then 68 years old and an acclaimed artist, suggested they create their own memorial. The 5 women stood in a circle where the locked room had once been, held hands, and recited the names of their companions. When they reached Jung Hae-won's name, the one who had died before liberation, they paused. A moment of silence heavier than words. Choi Min-ah, still working part-time at 70, spoke. She did not live to see freedom, but she was free when she died. We held her. We prayed for her. She was not alone. The others murmured agreement. In that small act of remembrance, they reclaimed a piece of history the world had tried to erase. Martinez died in 2001 at the age of 80. His obituary in the El Paso Times mentioned his military service and his decades of work with veterans, but it did not mention the 14 Korean nurses. That story remained private, shared only with family. Among his effects, his children found a box of letters, all from the same women in the Philippines, spanning 56 years. The letters chronicled ordinary lives, marriages and children and grandchildren, careers and retirements, joys and sorrows. But running through all of them was a single thread: gratitude for the moment when death had been certain and a stranger had chosen mercy. One letter, from Kim Sun-ja, written in 1995, included a line his daughter would later read at his memorial service. "You taught me that the measure of a person is not in the grand gestures, but in the small acts of kindness performed when no one is watching and nothing is required. You could have walked past that door, you chose not to." That choice echoes through 60 lives, my children and grandchildren, all living because you stopped to check one more building. By 2010, only 3 of the 14 nurses remained alive. They were in their 80s, scattered across the Philippines and Korea, their bodies frail but their memories sharp. A documentary filmmaker found them and asked to tell their story. They agreed, not for fame, but because they feared the story would die with them. The documentary, titled The Locked Room, premiered in 2012. It featured interviews with the survivors, archival footage of Manila's liberation, and dramatic recreations of the 15 days. The film won awards and was screened at museums and universities. Suddenly, a story that had been whispered in private was being told to the world. Viewers were struck by the ordinariness of the women, grandmothers who laughed easily and spoke of the past without melodrama. They did not present themselves as heroes or victims, but simply as people who had survived. Their refusal to be defined solely by their trauma was, in itself, an act of resistance against the forces that had tried to destroy them. In 2015, 70 years after liberation, the Philippine government erected a small memorial near the site of the old hospital. A bronze plaque, funded by donations from Korean and American veterans groups, bore the names of 15 Korean nurses and a simple inscription: "Abandoned by war, found by mercy." February 14th, 1945. At the dedication ceremony, Choi Min-ah, then 90, spoke to a small crowd of dignitaries and history enthusiasts. Her voice was thin but clear. "We were taught that war makes monsters of men, and often it does. But we also learned that in the darkest moments, some choose to be human. That choice matters. It is why we are here today." The ceremony concluded with the lighting of 15 candles, one for each woman. The last candle, for Jung Hae-won, was lit by a young Filipino nurse who had been inspired by their story to enter the profession. "As the flame caught," Choi Min-ah whispered, "we remember. We survived. We lived well." The wind carried her words across the city where, decades earlier, 14 women had been found on the edge of death and pulled back by hands that chose compassion over cruelty. Manila had been rebuilt, its scars buried under concrete and progress. But some scars run deeper than buildings, etched into memory and passed down through generations. The story of the 15 Korean nurses is not a story of war's glory or nation's triumph. It is a smaller story, quieter, but no less important. It is the story of what happens when one person sees another's suffering and decides it matters. When a corpsman checks one more building, when soldiers share their rations, when nurses treat strangers with the same care they would give family. These acts did not end the war, they did not change military strategy or political outcomes, but they saved 14 lives, and those 14 lives rippled outward, touching hundreds more, creating families, inspiring students, building a legacy of survival that war could not erase. In the end, the greatest victory was not the liberation of Manila or the defeat of Japan. It was the moment when women who had been taught to expect death received instead water, blankets, and words they never thought they would hear. "You're safe now. You're safe with me." Those words, spoken by a young corpsman from Texas to a dying woman from Korea, became a promise that outlasted the war itself. And in honoring that promise, in surviving and thriving and telling their story, the 14 women proved that even in history's darkest chapters, humanity persists. Not because it is easy, not because it is guaranteed, but because sometimes someone chooses to make it so. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.